Welcome to the demonstration on AAA authentication on Ruckus ICX switches. AAA provides authentication, authorization, and accounting functionality for a Ruckus switch. So let's take a look at the configuration. So with AAA, we can enable accounting, authentication, or authorization. Authentication confirms who you are to allow you into the system. Authorization dictates what you're capable of doing, and accounting keeps track of what actions have been taken by who through the system. So we're going to focus on authentication today. So let's go ahead and take a look at what options we have there. So with authentication, we can authenticate .1x access, enable mode access, or privilege exec mode, login, the SNMP server, or the web server. So we're going to focus on the enable, so basically getting into privilege exec mode on the switch, and we will define methods of how we authenticate users who want to get into privilege exec mode and be able to make changes in the switch. So with enable, we have a couple of different lists. It's the default list or implicit user list. Pretty much always, we always use the default list, but there are some other options available for you. So we'll do the default, and this gives us options now of how we're going to authenticate. We can authenticate with the enable password, the telnet password or LAN password, a local username configured on the switch, no authentication, radius, TACACS, and TACACS Plus. So what we do with these is we create a list of methods that are potentially available to authenticate a user, and in this list, it follows through in order, and if one of these items is not available to authenticate, it'll roll to the next one. For example, if we do radius here, we still have the option to add the next level of authentication. So we can use enable, or we'd probably prefer to have a local username and password next, and then after a local username and password, maybe we'll just use the enable password. So that's what we'll configure here. We're going to set this up so that when someone tries to authenticate getting into the privilege exec mode using the enable command, it'll check for a radius server. If no radius server is present, it will move to a local username and password. If no local username and password are configured, it'll roll to the enable password. Now, the key here is that these things won't roll to the next if they fail. So for example, if a user tries to authenticate to the radius server and the radius server rejects that user, it would not move over to local. It would immediately reject that authentication and not let that user in. So these are only available for the event that one of these things is not available. So a non-response is what allows something to roll to the next, not a failed response. So when we run this command, take a look. This switch is pretty much at factory defaults. So it gives me a warning. It says there's no local username, so I need to configure that if I want to use it as a method for authentication. And there's no enable password, so I should configure that for that enable authentication. So let's go ahead and do that. Just use a simple username user1 with a password of password1. So now I have that available to me. That's good, because if I don't configure these things, right now I don't have a radius server. So if I didn't configure at least one of these options, the username and password or the enable password, I would effectively be cut off from this switch and have to go through the whole reboot and recovery process. So now having this, at least I do have a method of logging in. But let's go ahead and create our enable super user password as well. And we'll just give that super PW as the password. Okay, so now we have an enable password. We have a user1 with a password. So let's watch this in action. Okay, so we're out. We need to get into enable mode. So we'll run enable. So what it's going to do, notice it prompts me for a username. This username is prompting me for a local username in the local user database because I don't have a radius server configured. But first thing it did do was look to radius, or look to a radius configuration, and realize that I don't have a radius server configured. So the next thing it did is it rolled over to a local username. So let's go ahead with user1 and password 1. So I'm in. Local user database was fine. Now let's try this one more time. Let's log in incorrectly and see what happens. So user 1, I'll put in some gibberish, and it immediately rolls me back out. So again, because there is a local user database available, it will not roll over to check the enable password. So it would only do that in the event that I did not have a local user configured in the local user database, that it would use the enable password to allow authentication. So that's AAA authentication on an ICX switch. Thank you for viewing this demonstration. Hopefully you come back for more demonstrations in the future. Thank you.